Welcome to Refuting Rationality, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist Rationality Rules. In today's episode, Mr. Rationality is going to be sharing his faulty views on morality. Let's begin.
As many of you are already aware, in the current state of moral philosophy we have three subject areas. Metaethics, which is concerned with where morality comes from and what moral terms mean. Normative ethics, which is concerned with forming standards that regulate right and wrong conduct. And applied ethics, which is concerned with specific controversial issues, such as abortion, animal rights, climate change, capital punishment and nuclear war. Now, since I'm predominantly concerned with metaethics, because that's where I see the most confusion, that's what I'm going to primarily focus on within this video. The field of metaethics itself tends to be divided into two overarching schools, Objectivism and Relativism, with the former positing that morality exists as a matter of fact, and the latter positing that morality exists as a matter of opinion. For example, Catholicism advocates an objective metaethic, since it posits that morality exists as a product of divine law, and as such is comparable to any scientific law, while cultural relativism advocates a relativistic metaethic, since it posits that morality is entirely a cultural construct. My view, however, is that morality is both objective and relative. That is, it exists as a matter of fact and it's relative to certain conditions. Now on the surface, because of conditioning, this might seem absurdly contradictory, but I assure you it's not. It's no more absurd than the science of health, which is a great comparison that's been utilised by the likes of Sam Harris before, because while health is rightfully acknowledged as an objective science, it's also acknowledged as a relativistic science, since facts about health are relative to species, and in some cases, individuals.
And like health, there are facts about health which apply to everybody, regardless of species or individual. And it sounds to me like he's conflating the metaethics with the normative ethics, and possibly even conflating the application. The application of morality can be relative to the circumstances, but there is an objective standard by which those are contingent upon.
Anyhow, I'm getting ahead of myself now. To back up a little, I'm going to take some advice from Voltaire and talk semantics. First off, so far as I'm concerned, words such as good, bad, right, wrong, should, shouldn't, ought, oughtn't, virtuous, evil, and indeed ethical, unethical, moral, and immoral are, I would argue, utterly meaningless without a reference. They're descriptive, and without a reference, which is granted either consciously or unconsciously, they're vacuous. To demonstrate this, consider the following. Is it good or moral to punch someone in the face? In general, no, it's not. But notice that by saying in general, I just assumed a reference, that being our social contract. If I assume the reference of a boxing fight, then punching someone in the face is good. In fact, it's the right thing to do. And so my point being here is that from a foundational perspective, words such as moral and immoral are meaningless. To say that something is moral is to say that something is good, and we can't say that something is good unless we have a reference.
A better word for reference would be a standard. Anytime you assume something is either right or wrong, you are assuming a standard or a reference point. He says it's morally right to punch the person if you're in a boxing match. But is it morally right to be in a boxing match? What is the ultimate standard you are using to figure that one out? Also, you did not have to say in general to assume a reference or a standard. Just by answering the question, you assumed a standard. The only thing saying in general does is imply exceptions. In fact, saying whether something is good or evil isn't just assuming a standard, it's assuming an objective standard.
Moving on, what's the definition of objective? Because this word, in my opinion, is the sticking point for most people when it comes to morality, and I think it's because while we've largely outgrown religion, we're yet to outgrow religious language. There are two prominent conceptions of objectivity, one that's scientific and one that's philosophical. Scientists, and many philosophers, tend to view the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity as that of fact and opinion, and thus define an objective statement as a fact that isn't affected by an individual's feelings, biases, or interpretations, and therefore can typically be verified. While other philosophers and the religious tend to view the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity as that of independent of a subject and dependent on a subject, and thus define an objective statement as a statement that does not depend on a subject to exist. Now, both of these definitions suit their purpose, of course, but people often conflate and confuse them, and they do so especially when it comes to morality. To illustrate this, consider the following question. Is it objectively the case that you are now thinking? If your answer is yes, then that's because you're using the scientific definition of objective. It's an objective fact about human thought, and it's something that we can measure, infer, and indeed verify. But if you were using the philosophical definition, your answer would necessarily be no, because this fact depends on you, a subject, to exist. The problem, of course, is that people erroneously assert that because morality is subjective in the philosophical sense, it's also subjective in the scientific sense, when this obviously isn't the case.
And who asserts that exactly? I've certainly never asserted that, and I can't imagine anyone else asserting that either. Seems to be Mr. Rationality is doing some verbal gymnastics here to try and sell us his snake oil. I don't even see a use for this philosophical objective statement since he's talking about that wouldn't really just be covered by the scientific objective statement definition. When I say morality is objective, it's because morality, something which is moral regardless of anybody's opinion. So much so that it would be moral regardless of even their existence. It was still wrong to steal before there was anything to steal. A key difference between his scientific objective statement and philosophical objective statement, I believe, is that the scientific one says a fact that isn't affected by individuals, while the philosophical one says a statement that is independent. So according to that definition, the philosophical objective statement doesn't have to be a fact. It could just mean any statement. I don't know if that actually changes anything, but for future reference, any reference to morality would be considered a fact that isn't affected by an individual's feelings, biases, or interpretations. But I actually wouldn't limit that to just individuals. I would say a fact that isn't affected by a subject's feelings, biases, or interpretations. Because we're talking about morality, and whatever is moral would be moral even if humankind did not exist. I really feel like he's trying to obfuscate with these definitions. Hopefully it'll clear up later in the video.
I want to touch upon the great David Hume's is-ought guillotine. I'll dedicate an entire video to this topic upon a time, as most people, including some otherwise reputable sources, completely misunderstand the problem. But for now, here are some brief remarks. Hume famously observed that people erroneously make claims about what ought to be based entirely on what is, that they attempt, but fail, to derive prescriptive conclusions from entirely descriptive facts. For example, consider this seemingly sound argument. Premise 1. Humans typically die if they're hanged. Premise 2. Ken is a human. Therefore, we ought not to hang Ken. This looks like a valid deductive argument, but it's not. It's a non sequitur. Even with both premises being true, the conclusion doesn't logically follow. It attempts to get a prescriptive statement from descriptive facts, but it fails. Sure, humans tend to die if hanged, and Ken is indeed a human, but how exactly do these statements of fact tell us that we ought not to hang Ken? Exactly, they don't. And so Hume's lesson, so far as I can tell, is don't assume that you can draw moral conclusions directly from statements of fact, and watch out for arguments that do. It's a brilliant observation and a very useful tip, but it's not the same as saying that morality doesn't exist, or that we can't derive a valid ought, is it? So how then can we derive a valid ought? Well, it's actually very easy. It's by having a valid deductive argument that includes at least one ought. Or in other words, it's by getting an ought from an ought. For example, premise 1, we ought to live consistently with our evolution. This is an ought. Premise 2, humans evolved to eat meat. This is an is. Therefore, we ought to eat meat. To put this in the language of mathematical logic, this argument is valid, since its conclusion does indeed follow from its premises, and it's objectively verifiable, especially given recent advancements in scientific tools. But it's not necessarily sound, because most people don't believe that we ought to live consistently with our evolution. And so my point being here is that we can deduce a valid ought, but whether we find it to be sound is dependent on if we personally accept the premises.
So most of that was actually pretty accurate, and I don't need to say much on it. But the example he gives is terrible. Premise 1 is false just because evolution is false. So it is unsound. And yes, it is valid. And yes, you can get an ought from an ought. However, where did you get the first ought? For the sake of being easier to say, we should change ought to should. So the first false premise would be, we should live consistently with our evolution. Humans evolved to eat meat, also false. Therefore, we should eat meat. But why should we? If we did evolve, which we didn't, why should we live consistently with our evolution? He is arbitrarily assuming a standard which he can get his conclusion from, that we should eat meat, but he claims that that standard, which would be his first premise, is subjective. And if his standard is subjective, then so is his conclusion. So ironically, in his attempt to straddle the fence and say he can be both objective and subjective, he's actually just being subjective.
This, finally, brings me to what is the most unique aspect of my moral perspective. I'm convinced that there are two types of oughts, or goods, or shoulds, or morals, etc., and I currently refer to them as axiomatic oughts and contingent oughts. Axiomatic oughts are feelings of obligation that exist self-evidently, and they do so without proof or argument. They just are. They're facts of nature. An example is my current conviction that I ought to survive. I didn't reason myself into this ought, I just have it. It's an axiomatic fact of nature, not an assumption. Now that might seem dissatisfying, but so too, at least in my opinion, are all axiomatic facts. While it's not justified, it really is the case that I have this compulsion, this ought, this impulse, this urge to behave in a certain way, and this can be objectively verified through the scientific method, and so it's a scientific fact. And what's more, thanks to Darwin, we now know precisely why I have it in the first place.
Now we're getting into the meat of the issue. Earlier, he defined objective as independent of a person's feelings. But here, his axiomatic ought is a feeling of obligation. So right away there seems to be some inconsistency in his logic. But I think I figured out what that inconsistency is. He's basing what he calls objective morality on a subjective foundation, which of course is not possible. You would never be able to get an objective moral truth out of a subjective reality. Now, I actually have no problem with him calling morality an axiom, or certain moral truths an axiom, but your axioms should still be justified. Axioms are accepted without proof. That does not mean they can't be proven after the fact. You just have to have the right worldview to do it. And Mr. Rationality does not have the right worldview, which is why he thinks it's impossible to justify them. He says he ought to survive. Now that's fine as an axiom, but again, you can still justify it. I can justify it in one simple sentence. God wants me to survive. That's it. One axiom justified. The scientific fact that he has the feelings doesn't really amount to much, because that's not objective. If you're going by your feelings, that is subjective. And I believe I've covered this in an earlier video, but evolution cannot explain objective morality. And if he tries to explain it does, then he will be begging the question, because in his attempt to do so, he will have already assumed certain moral truths, such as whether or not it's bad to feel pain.
Contingent oughts are feelings of obligation that are predicated on axiomatic oughts and one or more statements of fact. And because they're predicated on statements of fact that may or may not be correct, they too may or may not be correct. To illustrate this, let's take two contingent oughts, the first being that I ought to vaccinate my child, and the second being that I ought to remove a segment of my child's genitalia. How is it that I can say that one ought or moral statement is right and that the other is wrong? Well, it's by viewing them in their entire context. Unlike axiomatic oughts, contingent oughts are, well, contingent on premises, and in both of these cases they're contingent on the same axiomatic ought, that being, I ought to prevent my child from suffering, and at least one statement of fact, or is statement. And so, syllogistically, the first argument goes as follows. Premise 1, I ought to prevent my child from suffering. Premise 2, it is the case that vaccinating my child will reduce her chances of suffering. Therefore, I ought to vaccinate my child. And the second argument goes, Premise 1, I ought to prevent my child from suffering. Premise 2, it is the case that removing a segment of my child's genitalia will reduce her chances of suffering. Therefore, I ought to remove a segment of my child's genitalia. Now, both of these arguments are valid, as their conclusions follow from their premises, but only one of them is sound. And so the reason I can say that the vaccine ought is correct, or sound, and that the circumcision ought is incorrect, or unsound, is because it is indeed scientifically, objectively the case, given the current conditions, that vaccinating a child will reduce their chances of suffering, and it is not objectively the case, given the current conditions, that removing a segment of a child's genitalia will reduce their chances of suffering. Thus, the former is right because its premises are correct, and the latter is wrong because its second premise is incorrect. Now again, we can quarrel about the axiomatic or, but here's the thing. If you already accept it, for whatever reason, or, let's face it, lack thereof, then for all intent and purposes, what's the problem? Nature has made it so that we are born with axiomatic oughts, and while, again, this is intellectually dissatisfying, we just have to get on with it. As inconvenient as it might be, we are not born with a blank slate, and all moral discourse must, finally, accept this brute fact.
Should I prevent my child from suffering? If you want to fall on the axiom of I ought to prevent my child from suffering, you've just begged the question. We are indeed not born with a blank slate. We are all made in the image of God and have morality written on our hearts. And circumcisions are not for the preventing of suffering. That was a very bad example. And again, his definition for a contingent ought is a feeling of obligation. So this one's not objective either. He's just one big moral relativist. A statement of fact, by definition, is correct. I'm going to give Mr. Rationality the benefit of the doubt on that one and assume he just phrased it badly.
Anyhow, to sum up, I do not believe, for example, that it's always morally wrong to murder. There's no transcendent objective law that we must abide by, and I don't believe that we must do anything. But I do believe, as a matter of scientific fact, that we are born with intrinsic axiomatic values, goals, and inclinations, or in other words, axiomatic oughts, and that we construe contingent oughts in reference to these axiomatic oughts and perceived facts. And because those facts can be erroneous, so too can the contingent oughts predicated upon them. Or to put this more personally, while we all have different values and preferences, and we all believe different things, the vast majority of us have the axiomatic ought of not wanting to suffer, and consequently, we want to live in a world in which no matter who we were conceived by, no matter what genetic disposition we inherited, and no matter what environment we grew up in, we were given ample love, patience, and opportunity. And so given this mutual acceptance of what is good, let's work together to create a better future.
Murder, by definition, is an unjust killing. So when Mr. Rationality says it's not always wrong to murder, he's saying it's not always wrong to be unjust. Or, it's not always unjust to be unjust. Perhaps he meant it's not always wrong to kill, but that would not at all mean that there isn't a transcendent moral law. Nobody must do anything, but we are all obligated. We don't have to feed our children, but we are obligated to. If you want to be a good person, then you have to feed your children. Facts cannot be erroneous. I let him get away with it once, but I'm not going to do it a second time. If a fact is in error, then it is not a fact, and therefore you should never have called it a fact in the first place. Not wanting to suffer is not an ought. That is a personal preference. Should we suffer, or should we avoid suffering? That is an ought, and it is not based on how we feel about it. How we feel about it might change our interpretation of it, but whatever the answer is, it is true regardless of how we feel. It is amazing that at the beginning of this video, he said he believed that morality was both objective and subjective. But after finishing it, I have concluded that his morality is completely subjective. He's basing his entire moral compass on his feeling. Or he makes an argument from majority to say it's based on everybody's feelings, or the majority of the feelings, which would still be subjective, because it's based on feelings. On the bright side, he did recognize that we have moral law written on our hearts, though he didn't phrase it that way.